Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Thank you to Modern Day Debates for hosting, and thank you to everyone watching. The debate today is about Sharia versus human rights. Sharia just means Islamic law. Islamic law is not just corporal punishment, it's a holistic system of life that governs everything from how Muslims pray and worship, how they get married, to criminal punishments and even economic matters. My main point today is simple. Harris Sultan and other ex-Muslims are playing a con game. They're being dishonest with their audience and sometimes outright lying to them. Today I'm going to focus on 3 of their biggest lies. Lie number 1. Promoters of human rights like Harris claim human rights are a beacon of hope. Human rights are the mark of civilization and progress, and everyone should adopt human rights. But is this true? Do human rights bring prosperity and progress? 192 out of 195 countries of the world have officially adopted the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's 98% of all countries in the world. Do we see prosperity and progress in these countries? Let's look at the GDP per capita. North America is at $61,000 per capita. Western Europe is at $54,000 per capita. Australia and New Zealand are at about $55,000. These regions are at the top of the heap. It must be because they're so strong in terms of human rights and democracy, right? But let's compare that to Eastern Europe. Just $9,000 GDP per capita. Latin America is less than $7,400 per capita. India, the world's largest democracy, is only at $2,000. Sub-Saharan Africa is at $1,500. For Muslim countries, the average GDP per capita is $7,500. And if you exclude the oil-rich countries, the number is at $4,600. So when people want to say Muslim countries are economically behind because of lack of human rights, the reality is Muslim countries are at the same level as most of these human rights respecting countries. Why do countries like America, UK, Britain, Australia have 10 times, 20 times, 30 times the GDP per capita of countries in Latin America, Eastern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa? Why this massive inequality? None of the countries in these regions are Muslim, and all of them respect and abide by human rights. Consider Botswana. Considered one of the oldest democracies in the Southern Hemisphere, one of the earliest adopters of LGBT rights in Africa, very high female involvement with voting and politics, but it has only 1/10 the GDP per capita of the US. Or consider Haiti. They ratified their secular constitution in 1805, over 200 years ago. They had a female president in 1990. Their GDP per capita is 1/50th the United States. And on and on. On this other side of the coin, you have countries that have openly rejected human rights and democracy, like China, which has a GDP of $10,000, and Singapore, which has a GDP per capita of $65,000. So either way you look at it, there is no correlation between adoption of human rights and democracy with economic prosperity. Harris, you need to explain this. These countries that have nothing to do with Islam, that have adopted human rights and democracy and women's rights and LGBT rights, why are they stuck in abject poverty? Because you want to blame problems of poverty, problems of violence and social dysfunction on Islam. So how do you explain these countries that have nothing to do with Islam, that have these same problems and often worse problems? Why is it that human rights only brings prosperity for North America and Western Europe, and the majority of the rest of the world suffers? Better yet, explain why people living in human rights abiding democracies in Latin America, in Africa, are literally dying to migrate to America and Western Europe. Why are they risking their lives to escape their human rights hellholes, Harris? Explain that. And we don't have to just limit ourselves to GDP. Look at the life expectancy. Latin America, Eastern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africans have 5 to 15 years lower life expectancy. Those countries also reported far lower happiness levels. According to the UN's 2017 World Happiness Report, according to self-reported happiness, countries of North America and Western Europe have the highest levels of happiness, while Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Eastern Europe have the lowest levels. So why is this, Harris? None of these countries are Muslim countries. They're all democratic countries, secular countries. Some of them even have very high levels of atheism. So why aren't they enjoying progress and prosperity? Let's call this question the Botswana question. If Harris cannot explain these discrepancies, if he cannot answer this Botswana question, then he should admit that democracy and human rights are just a big hoax. Harris wants people to hate Islam by trying to pin the issue of poverty and social dysfunction to Muslim countries, but as we've seen, it's not a strong connection. Lie number 2, Harris wants to pretend like his problem is with Islam, but in reality, his criticisms of Islam apply to every single religion and every traditional form of culture, because all traditional religions and cultures clash with modern human rights. Traditional Christianity, traditional Judaism, Native American culture, Hindu culture, Shinto religion, all of these traditional ways of life clash with modern human rights. This is because human rights is an extremist ideology. Human rights ideology says that the most important thing is individual liberty and equality. Individual liberty and equality have to be prioritized over literally every other human value. This is extremism. Every other traditional religion and life philosophy says, no, individual liberty and equality have limits. Islamic law, for example, agrees with the human rights activists that, like Harris, that individual liberty and equality are beautiful values. For example, in Islam, you have the right to your wealth, to your property, the right to privacy, and so forth. Also, Islam provides legal equality between all people, men and women, Muslims and non-Muslims, in certain, but not all, areas of the law. But Islam says, yes, individual liberty and equality are beautiful values, but they're just 2 out of many beautiful values. And sometimes you have to restrict liberty and equality in order to preserve other important values and institutions. A useful analogy here is imagine offering a child candy or broccoli. If it were up to the child, he would choose the candy every time. Eventually, the child would get diabetes and die. That's what human rights liberalism is like. It's just about giving the candy of individual liberty and saying that's all that matters. Islam says, look, there's nothing wrong with candy. In fact, we love candy. But if you only eat candy, you will die. You also need meat, dairy, vegetables, and carbs. As a simple example, in Islam, you can't have sex with whomever you want, whenever you want. There are strict restrictions on premarital and extramarital relations, and the obvious benefit of this is that it ensures strong and stable marriages. This is because of human biology and natural human psychology. Islamic law perfectly accounts for human nature, and abiding by the Sharia has these clear benefits for marriage. But human rights says, no. People should have 100% individual liberty and 100% sexual autonomy. You should have the right to sleep with whomever you want, whenever you want, unimpeded. That may sound good to those who have been indoctrinated by this extremist ideology, but we have to ask, what are the consequences of such a policy? Is a society that adopts unfettered sexual autonomy compatible with marriage, with love, with romance? Is it compatible with family? Well, we don't have to speculate. We can look at countries where this so-called human right has spread, and the statistics paint a very bleak, dark picture. And I'll discuss the exact statistics later in the debate, inshallah. Another example is family relations, because just family relations beyond just husband and wife. Science and anthropology say that humans have this deeply rooted biological drive to come together in families. And these families have a natural hierarchy with fathers as the heads of the household, then mothers, then children, and so forth. Again, this human behavior is biologically rooted, and historians and anthropologists point out that the same patriarchal family structure is found in 99% of human societies historically, including Islamic societies. But human rights extremism says, no, this kind of patriarchy with men over women violates the principle of equality. Men and women should all have the same authority, the same roles, and everything has to be exactly equal. This is not only an attack on Islamic law, this is an attack on human biology itself. This is an attack on 99% of world cultures which do have patriarchal family structures. And the result of this human rights extremism that has been forced onto the whole world for the past 200 years is that families are being destroyed. Again, I will share, inshallah, more information to justify all these points. But the main point is that marriage, family, community, and even the human race itself, these are things that have a deep-rooted biological basis. Islamic law preserves and protects these things by setting the proper balance with individual liberties and equality and other important values. Modern human rights, in contrast, destroys marriage, destroys family, destroys community in all traditional cultures and the human race overall, because it puts individual liberty and equality above all else. The question is, does Harris believe in balance, or is he the extremist? Let's call this the balance question. Ultimately, Harris would be lying if he said that his problem is solely with Islam. He should be honest. The problems he has with Islam violating human rights, he has with all traditional cultures and religions that limit individual liberty for the sake of protecting marriage, family, and community. Harris should be honest. Instead of saying human rights versus Sharia, he should say human rights versus literally every traditional culture and religion in the world. Lie number 3. What is the difference between Harris Sultan and European colonizers? What is the difference between Harris Sultan and the neocons in Washington who pushed for the murderous invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan 20 years ago and continue to agitate for human rights in the Muslim world today? What is the difference? Let's call this the colonial question. Because all the arguments Harris brings against Muslims in Afghanistan or Pakistan or anywhere else, all of those exact same arguments have been used by European colonizers historically against not only Muslims, but against Native Americans, against Africans, against Aboriginals, against the Chinese. When Harris says Muslims abuse women because they practice polygamy, that exact same argument was used by American settlers in the 18th and 19th century to dehumanize Native Americans and justify genociding them. When Harris says Muslims are barbaric because they use corporal punishments against criminals, that exact same argument was used by the European colonial empire against the African tribes they genocided. The real question is, does Harris think the colonial project was a good thing? After all, colonialism is what brought modern human rights to all these different parts of the world. The West invading and occupying the world to bring freedom and democracy isn't something that just happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's something that's been happening for over 200 years. If Harris thinks human rights are so amazing, then does he think it was a good thing that Africa was colonized? Or Latin America? Does he think it was a good thing that India was colonized? Wasn't it colonialism that brought his own Muslim ancestors in the subcontinent to the light of reason and human rights? So Harris, my question is simple. Clearly the world is not going to freely choose human rights. History has definitively proven that, and Afghanistan is only the most recent example. If you really want people to abandon their religions, abandon their ways of life, their cultural heritage, and replace them with human rights, you have to force them. And forcing people inevitably gets very brutal and very bloody. That's the only way. That's why the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries are soaked with the blood of non-Europeans who were killed in the name of spreading freedom and democracy. So are you going to be honest, Harris, and stand by colonialism? Look, if human rights are so wonderful as you claim, Harris, then 200 years of brutal colonialism and millions of dead must have been worth it. Why don't you own it, Harris? When you advocate human rights, you're like a chef that presents this appetizing sausage to your audience, but you aren't honest about how that sausage is made. Muslims, at least, are honest. Islam is honest that spreading Islam sometimes requires war. That's acknowledged in the Quran and the example of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And I'm not equating Muslim conquest with European colonialism, by the way, because there are major differences that we can talk about. For one, Euro-American colonialism, past and present, is genocidal, and the death counts make that very clear. But my point is, you human rights activists are not honest. You don't own up to the true horrifying nature of spreading freedom and democracy. So Harris, if human rights are so brilliant and fantastic, then be consistent. Tell us that the millions of deaths and the brutal occupations are worth it. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, right? So just own it. Stop pretending you're something you're not. You're just playing a con game. The only way you can credibly sell human rights to your audience is if you hide all these things or gloss over them. You hide the brutal history of human rights. You hide the fact that human rights destroys marriage, family, community, how it attacks every traditional way of life. You have to hide all these things because otherwise no one would buy it. And actually it would make Islam look pretty good because Islam is fighting against this human rights monster. But you can't be honest, can you, Harris? So just stop with this con game. Okay, my claim again is that liberal secular human rights regime has been a disaster for the human race. Note that in Harris's response, he didn't address any of my questions, so we're going to see if he's going to answer anything in this debate. I'm going to focus on four main examples. Liberal human rights destroys marriage, family, community, and the human race overall. So let's start with marriage. I want to address many, maybe most of you in the audience directly. Do you know why you are alone? Do you know why you can't get married? Do you know why, if you are married, you are very likely to get divorced? Do you know why there's a very high likelihood that you will die alone? All of this is because the liberal human rights regime is destroying marriage. The fact of the matter is, marriage is deeply rooted in natural human instincts. We crave romantic affection. We want to give and receive love with a long-term committed partner who we have children with. Psychologists and neurobiologists call this pair bonding. Pair bonding is this instinct to bond with the opposite sex in a long-term relationship. Most animal species don't have this pair bonding instinct, but 3% of animals do have pair bonding, like most birds, certain primates, and also human beings. Being in long-term, committed, married relationships is associated with countless benefits in terms of health and happiness. The Washington Post reported that studies prove that married people have happier, healthier relationships than unmarried couples who simply live together. But human rights has destroyed marriage, and it's easy to understand why. If you're constantly prioritizing individual liberty, individual happiness, then that conflicts with the long-term sacrifice and commitment that marriage requires. Stable marriages require you to give up your individual autonomy in many significant ways, and liberalized people are not interested in that, and the stats prove it. Nowadays, most people are not getting married. According to Pew, 65% of millennials between the ages of 23 and 38 were unmarried in 2019. Pew predicts that in a few short years, 75% of millennials will never be married. This will be an all-time low according to Pew. Now you might think maybe people are not getting married, but they're still having long-term unmarried relationships. Not true. According to the Washington Post and the General Social Survey, the share of U.S. adults reporting no sex in the past year reached an all-time high in 2018, underscoring a 3-decade trend. About 1 in 4 adults did not have sex the whole year, and the numbers continue to increase every year in what experts call sex recession. In some countries like Denmark and Spain, governments have to literally beg their population to have sex. Now, if you're in the minority who does get married, then the likelihood that your marriage will end in divorce is very high if you live in liberal democracies. In the US, about 44% of marriages end in divorce. In France, 51%. In the UK, 42%. These stats don't even factor in long-term separation between couples. If we counted that, the rates would be even higher. The likelihood your spouse will cheat on you is also very high in free liberal countries. Some studies have found that the infidelity rate is as high as 26% in some Western countries. Those people who do get married are also going to have lower quality marriages. Studies show that having multiple sex partners prior to marriage reduces marital quality. People are less satisfied with their spouse when they have been around the block a few times, literally. By the time people do get married in the West, in their 30s or 40s, they have had so many failed past relationships that they're often emotionally damaged. The person you're marrying comes with all this baggage in addition to your own baggage. So the overall marital quality suffers. But Muslims, because of Islam and Sharia, are on the opposite end of all this. Yes, modernity is affecting Muslims, unfortunately, but we're on the opposite end in terms of these stats. Numerous ethnographic studies of Muslim countries prove this. Muslims get married more, they get married younger, they have far lower levels of premarital and extramarital sex, they have lower divorce rates, and due to all of this, they have higher quality marriages, love, and romance. This is because of the rules in Islamic law that specify gender separation, hijab, and modesty, restrictions on fornication and adultery, patriarchy and gender roles, family involvement in marriage, and so forth. These are rules the liberal human rights regime considers backwards and misogynistic, but these are the same exact rules that save Muslim marriages from the destruction that Western society is suffering from. So Harris can give this abstract discussion of objective good versus evil, but marriage and love is something that humans all value. And I'm citing stats, I'm citing studies that everyone can agree with and everyone feels viscerally because that's human nature. Yeah, so Harris, it looks like you're gish galloping. You're just giving all of these random points. Like, can you just specify something that you want me to respond to? It seems like you're just rambling. You know, the topic of the debate is Sharia and human rights, and you're just bringing all these different theological issues. So try to focus.
From Sharia.
Don't interrupt me. You have specific questions that I gave you clearly that you can respond to on human rights, but you're just bringing up all of these random topics. So on the issue of family, look, I'm bringing objective arguments, unless you want to say that family is not valuable or marriage is not valuable, okay? But otherwise, family and marriage and love, these are valuable things. Objectively, all humans agree. Is living in a strong, stable family with mother, father, grandparents, uncles, and aunts a human right? The vast majority of human beings throughout history and today have lived in these extended families, and countless studies show the psychological and sociological benefits of living in strong, stable kinship groups. Other studies show that not having family or living in broken families is associated with higher crime, higher depression, higher drug use, higher suicide rate, higher mental health problems, and so forth. Again, it's easy to understand how emphasis on individual liberty and equality above all else is antithetical to objective family value. Family often requires you to sacrifice your own personal desires for the benefit of kith and kin. Taking care of children or taking care of the elderly are significant burdens. If you constantly tell people that maximum freedom is the most important thing above all else, it's no surprise that people will choose self-interest over family again and again. And eventually the institution of family will die off, which presumably you think is a bad thing, Harris. You might have even heard this anecdotally from friends who say bluntly, I have my own dreams and ambitions. I can't waste time on children or my parents. This is the anti-family sentiment that has spread like cancer in the modern world, and it's because of prioritizing individual liberty. And all the stats, again, prove it. Just look at average household size. For example, according to Pew, North America and Europe have the smallest average household sizes, whereas the Muslim world has double the household sizes of the West. Pew Research also shows that living alone is more common in wealthier countries, especially North America and Western Europe. Fertility rates are plummeting throughout the modern world. UN report shows that in Europe, the fertility rate is below replacement, only 1.6 child per woman. The same thing in North America, below replacement levels, but Muslim world, it's double or triple those fertility rates. This another metric that represents the death of family is the rise of single-parent households. According to Pew, in the US, about 1 in 4 children are in single-parent households. In the UK, 1 in 5, and these numbers have dramatically increased over the past 50 years. What this means is that even the very few children that are being born in the developed world live with a single parent, usually the mom, and she, of course, has to work to make ends meet. So this is not even the nuclear family. Forget about extended family. Even the nuclear family has been destroyed in the modern West. What this means is that realistically, a high percent of children in the West don't have any family to speak of. No father, no siblings, no grandparents, no cousins surrounding them. Now, I can list for you a bunch of studies that demonstrate that children raised in these single-parent households are at increased risk of dropping out of school, increased risk of being incarcerated, doing drugs. Other studies show children from single-family households have double the risk of mental health problems. They're more likely to be abused, more likely to commit suicide, and on and on. And this makes sense from a biological and psychological standpoint. For tens of thousands of years, humans have lived in large families with their own flesh and blood. When you strip that all away, like in the modern human rights West, what's that going to do to people psychologically? What is it going to do to them sociologically? Again, we see Muslims at the opposite end of the spectrum with all of these stats, and this is because of the rules in Islamic law, rules that specify parental rights, known as birr al-walidain, being good to parents, emphasis by the Prophet, peace be upon him, on fertility and having big families, emphasis on kinship rights and duties known as silat al-rahim, emphasis on getting married young, emphasis on taking care of elderly family members, not just dumping him in a nursing home, as is increasingly common throughout the West. And also the patriarchal family structure. That is also very important. So these are some of the rules that the liberal human rights regime considers contrary to personal freedom and human rights, but these are the exact same rules that preserve the important human institution of the family. Don't you think families are objectively good, Haris? Then explain why human rights are destroying them. Explain that. Okay, so I'm going to address slavery and sex slavery, but let me just be explicit for the audience, since Haris doesn't seem to be getting it. I'm arguing that Sharia law is superior to human rights because Sharia rule preserves marriage and family. Okay, and human rights doesn't. It destroys marriage and family and community and the human race. That's the argument. So let's move on to slavery. The reality is, to win a war in the pre-modern period, it was all about manpower. The main factor in whether your people would live or die was numbers. So this meant that if you won a battle, you couldn't just let the captives go, because they would just regroup and attack you again or join your enemies. So you only had two options. You either had to kill or enslave. Neither option is good, right? But that's just the nature of war. You always have to use violence against the other side. You either kill or enslave. So Haris, you want to criticize Islam and call Islam barbaric for having slavery, but imagine if I asked you this question. Do you support using weapons in war? Do you support using guns to shoot people or swords to stab people and kill people? Do you support that? Because all of that is violent. All of that is barbaric. Presumably you'd say, yeah, of course I support weapons and killing, because how else are you going to fight war and defend yourself? Well, that's exactly the point with slavery. In the pre-modern period, you couldn't have war without slavery any more than you could have war without weapons and killing. In other words, if killing people can sometimes be justified, then slavery can also sometimes be justified. And this is exactly what your friend, apostate prophet, accepted with open arms in our debate last year. Imagine in the future they invent a new technology for war where a laser shoots from space and can directly target any person in the world. And the technology is so precise that there are zero casualties other than the intended target. Then people in this future might look back at our time and say, look how barbaric those people in the 21st century were. Look how barbaric with their tanks and guns and bombs. Would that make any sense? That's exactly what you're doing by criticizing Islam for slavery. You should just acknowledge that slavery could be completely justified in certain circumstances, which, by the way, are the circumstances people have lived in for 99% of human history. Now, if you want to argue that Islam requires enslaving people today, I would say that that is not correct. It depends on the imam. If you read fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, this is very clear. There's no requirement that people captured in war are enslaved. This is discussed in classical fiqh books. For example, Bidayat al-Mujtahid by Ibn Rushd in the 12th century. Go to Kitab al-Jihad, and he summarizes the position of the four Sunni schools of fiqh. The imam has the option to pardon people and forego taking slaves in war. The imam does not have the option to suspend, for example, hudud punishments for lashing, like lashing for fornicators. But taking slaves is one of those issues where the imam can forego if it's in the best interest of the Muslim community. So in modern times, a hypothetical imam could exercise this option and still be 100% consistent with the most strict understanding of traditional Islamic law. Now, Haris, since you seem to be ignorant about these details about Islamic law, I'll do you a favor and steelman your argument for you. You could respond to me and say, well, Daniel, fine, slavery could be justified in the past, but now with modern technology, modern weapons, clearly slavery could never be justified. That means Islamic rules regarding slavery are not justifiable in our modern context, which means at least one aspect of Islamic law is obsolete. And if one aspect of Islamic law is obsolete due to modern technology, then why not all of Islamic law? This is actually the argument that a lot of Muslim liberal reformists make, but the response to this is simple. In the past, the low level of technology meant that in order to wield political power, war was necessary, which meant that slavery was necessary. The only difference today is there are bombs, nukes, fighter jets, drones, chemical and biological weapons. So now war is not about manpower, Basically, you have to believe that these new technologies are such a blessing and we're better off because at the very least, no one needs slavery to defend themselves, right? We live in a world of nukes and drones and weapons of mass destruction. So slavery is no longer needed. So the question is this actually a better world? Well, the harms associated with modern technologies like nukes and drones and mass surveillance, and you can't go to the bathroom without security agencies constantly monitoring your every move and every communication, these harms are far, far greater than the harms that existed in Islamic slavery. Frankly, these modern technologies are more terrifying. We have to look at the whole package. Which is the better world? One with the constant threat of nukes, nuclear annihilation, and constant terrorizing of the world's poor people with trillion-dollar weapons programs? Let's ask the people of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, or the Vietnamese children with horrifying birth defects because of chemical weapons like Agent Orange. Let's ask the Palestinian and Syrian refugees or children who are being burned alive with white phosphorus. In light of these modern technological horrors, the practice of Islamic slavery actually seems a far better alternative in the context of war, even if it were practiced today. Harris is completely misrepresenting Islamic law. In Islamic law and the Sharia, there's no obligation at all times to fight jihad, and there's no obligation at all times to take slaves or sex slaves. This is a complete misrepresentation. Harris needs to study Islamic law and fiqh because he's clearly ignorant. He has this kind of George Bush understanding of Islam or Donald Trump understanding of Islam, where it's just about killing and murdering. This is like from intelligence agencies, basically. You think ISIS is Islam. Nowhere have I endorsed ISIS or said that, yeah, they're the true representation of Islam. You are simply misrepresenting, and so it's a complete straw man. All you're doing is straw man arguments, and you can't even respond to any of the points that I made. I responded to your point about slavery, and now I'm going to respond to the point of sex slavery. But I just want to make one other point. Why don't you, Harris, you want me to get off my backside and go to Afghanistan while that country is being bombed and being threatened by the United States and just getting out of a 20-year brutal occupation with thousands of deaths and rapes? Why don't you tell your followers, Harris, all these followers that you have in Pakistan and India, all these Murtads like you, tell them to move to Botswana. Why don't you tell them to move to Botswana? Tell them to move to Haiti, because Botswana and Haiti, they have LGBT rights, they have women's rights. Why are they in Muslim countries? You should tell them to move to Botswana and Haiti. And in fact, it would be a more favorable position than Muslims moving to Afghanistan, because if your followers move to Botswana, Pakistan wouldn't bomb Botswana. Pakistan wouldn't try to agitate in Botswana and try to get them to adopt Sharia or Islamic law. They would be able to live their free lives with human rights and LGBT rights and women's rights. Why don't you do that, Harris? Is it because you're a con man? Is it because you're dishonest? You're not telling your followers in none of your videos, hey guys, human rights are great. Move from a Muslim country like Pakistan or Bangladesh and go to Botswana and Haiti. You never say that. So you're a hypocrite. You are a con man. Now let me get to the point about sex slavery. A good book I recommend is Lawrence Keeley's War Before Civilization. He explains that pre-modern war was primarily about manpower. The side that had the largest army was usually going to win. And if you had too few people, this made you an easy target for a larger group to attack you and wipe you out. This meant that women were very valuable in pre-modern societies because your society's ability to reproduce and build up the population is limited by the number of fertile wombs you have. Keeley says, and I quote, although the loss of even a large percentage of males will have no direct influence on a group's demographic fortunes, the loss of or gain of fertile women can mean the difference between population decline and growth. This is why Keeley argues all pre-modern civilizations took sex slaves. Again, this was a necessary aspect of war. If you did not take concubines, you were at a major disadvantage militarily because you either take concubines or your people get wiped off the face of the earth. There is no third option. So given that stark reality, yes, taking sex slaves was not only morally justified, it was morally necessary. And really, that's enough for the argument, but it's worth noting that the Sharia's rules on concubines and slaves in general are the most humane out of any other civilization. Again, slavery is not supposed to be a fun time, But Islam explicitly gives slaves many rights. They can't be mutilated, they can't be killed, they can't be prostituted. For women, if she gives birth to her master's baby, the baby is free, and she also is freed automatically when her master dies. These rules ensured that captured slaves very quickly integrated within larger Islamic society, especially after 1 or 2 generations. Contrast this with other societies in history that maintain a permanent subjugated slave class based on race or ethnicity. Islamic slavery is not like that, and that's why we see, for example, the Mamluks in the Middle Ages, who were a ruling class of Muslim slaves and the descendants of slaves, some of whom even reached the level of sultans and emirs in the Muslim caliphate as slaves. So the argument is very simple, Harris, but you haven't responded to anything that I've said. All you're doing is gish galloping, bringing in everything except the kitchen sink, misrepresenting straw man, and I think the audience sees that. I have a very simple argument. Sharia preserves marriage and family and community and the human race overall, and I'm bringing statistics, objective statistics, that if you think that family and marriage is not valuable, then say that. Say that you don't think it's valuable, so we know. But otherwise, I'm bringing objective arguments, and you haven't responded to any of my questions. Okay, again, Harris is just gish galloping. He's throwing everything out there. I'm going to actually respond with arguments. I'll just respond to this wife beating argument. Simple question, Harris. Do you believe women should be subject to laws? If you do believe that women should be subject to laws, then that means you believe women should be subject to all kinds of violence, including being beaten, jailed, even executed. That's what it means to be subject to the law. So there really is no difference between Islam on quote-unquote wife beating and human rights on this issue. Both Islam and human rights are in 100% agreement that women are accountable if they break the law, and that means Islam and human rights are in 100% agreement that women should be beaten. We only differ on who should do the beating. You say only the state. Only the state can punish women. Only the state should have a monopoly on all power and authority. Islam says, no, power should be distributed across kinship groups. And this means that the patriarch has authority to physically discipline members of his family, including his wives, if they violate important norms and values. Now let's ask women. If you violate the law, shouldn't you face consequences? And if you have to face consequences, who would you rather mete out those consequences? The cold iron fist of the bureaucratic, technocratic state, or the person who loves you the most in the whole world? The other important difference is that with the technocratic state, there is no higher authority. If the authoritarian modern state wants to persecute a particular woman, she has no recourse beyond the authority of the state. But in Islam, the husband is not the highest authority. If he is unjust to his wife, or if he causes serious abuse, then the wife can take him to the Islamic court and get paid damages. Or she can complain to her extended family and make her case so that other patriarchs can intervene and actually punish her husband. This is an organic system, and we see similar systems in all traditional cultures, Native American culture, even Christianity, read the Bible, even Judaism, read the Bible. They all have these kinds of rules. Nowadays, they've kind of reformed all of that. Islam is the only religion that's really honest on this. Look, let me put it like this. Is it possible to run a corporation without the possibility of physical discipline? No. You have to give managers in these corporations the right to beat their employees. How do you beat your employees? Well, if the employee violates the norms of the workplace, they get fired. And if they do not voluntarily comply, security will be called to remove them by force. Managers have to have the right to beat their employees. If they didn't have the right, you couldn't have a hierarchical organization. Islam recognizes this about family. Patriarchy is hardwired into our DNA. Neurobiologists, psychologists, they all acknowledge this. Women are naturally hypergamous, which means they're attracted to men who are stronger than them and higher status than them. Men that they can be dependent on. Men that are authorities over them. If you take out the patriarchy, this actually significantly reduces female attraction to their husbands. And they have studies on this where they ask women if they are more attracted to the macho man patriarch or a man who is at their same level in terms of size, strength, and status. And all women, including the hardcore feminists, prefer the higher status male. So if you promote egalitarian marriage, such as in human rights, you basically are ensuring less attraction, and that means less stable marriages. And this is exactly why marriages in the modern West have collapsed, because they're egalitarian. Islam says, no, if you want a strong society, you have to have strong families. And if you want strong families, they have to be patriarchal. And if they're patriarchal, that means the man has authority. And if he has authority, that means he has the power to physically maintain order. This is all a coherent, holistic system, and it's backed and underwritten by human biology, human psychology, that is universal across all human societies. It's hardwired into us. That's why this is an objective argument, Haris. You can't really understand that. I hope your followers, these Christians who are listening, these Hindus that are listening, I hope they're following, because this stuff is in their books as well, in their cultures as well. They've reformed all that and threw it out because they're cucking to modernity, but Muslims are not going to do that. We don't need to change our religion because it's revealed from God, to the creator of human beings. The creator of human beings knows our psychology, knows our biology, and that's why he has revealed this Sharia for the benefit and flourishing of humanity. And all of the statistics are proving this. You can't even respond to a single one. Okay, so first of all, Haris is saying that the state doesn't torture and abuse people. Hello, didn't you hear all of that statements I made about colonialism? How the state is genociding people, torturing people, raping women. The state powers, the human rights nations that you're defending in this whole debate, Haris, have raped how many women, have imprisoned how many women, have tortured through solitary confinement and waterboarding how many women? Okay, so you are a totalitarian because you only trust the state to have this kind of power. In Islam, men can't torture their wives. In Islam, men can't, according to the Sharia, men cannot, even physically hurt their wives in a permanent kind of way. And it's clear that you don't understand the employee-employer example, because in most cases, the employee, if the employer says, your manager says, do this, you are part of an organization, there's a hierarchy, and there's a relationship between the manager and the employee. So the manager says, we need to get this done, and everyone works together. There's no need to call security and physically remove, right, by force, and use a nightstick or a gun or a taser to remove employees. Similarly, in Islamic law, that kind of thing doesn't happen. It only happens rarely. As rare as it would be for these corporations to physically remove and taser their employees. So there's complete parallel here between because you have to have the ability to enforce structure and norms with any hierarchical organization. And Islam is just saying that families have that kind of authority, and the patriarch has that kind of authority. It's not unfettered authority, it's not unchecked authority, but he has that in the same way that many institutions, hierarchical institutions in the modern world West, human rights respecting West, they have those kinds of authorities and the right to beat people as well. The only difference is you think that only the state, only the totalitarian, bureaucratic, technocratic state should have those kinds of rights. So there's not really a substantive difference there, and we can talk about it more if you need more explanation. But look, I just want to emphasize, we have seen how the extremist liberal doctrine of individual liberty at all costs threatens marriage, family, community. But really, this extremism threatens the very nature of humanity itself. Through the use of technology, modern liberal states now claim that people have the right to change their gender. If you don't want to be one gender, you can use technology to change it. Even children as young as 3 should have this option, according to the gender and sexuality experts who operate at the highest levels of academia in the Western world and government. empowerment. But even beyond gender, people are now given the choice to change their species. Some people feel that they're not actually human, but they're actually cats or dogs deep down inside. Nowadays, certain surgeries can be used to physically alter bodies to transition people to their desired appearance. This is what philosophers like Yuval Harari call transhumanism. But gender and species transition is just the tip of the iceberg. You think they're going to stop with gender transition for kindergartners? No, no, no. They're just getting started. Imagine this human rights argument. When babies are born with a certain set of genitalia that could negatively impact their gender identity later on. We need to make sure to genetically alter all fetuses so that everyone is born without any particular set of genitalia. That way, everyone can choose their gender more easily and seamlessly when they're older. That's in line with maximum liberty and maximum equality. Do you have a problem with forcibly altering fetuses to be born without genitalia? That means you're a transphobe. That means you're a bigot. That means you're against equality and human rights. Or imagine this argument. Men naturally have more testosterone, which makes them more prone to violence and rape. It also makes them physically bigger than women in stature. So we need to create a law which forces men to take treatments to decrease their testosterone. Ideally, babies can be genetically modified so that everyone is born with the same exact amount of testosterone. That way we can eliminate rape, we can eliminate domestic violence, and also make men equal to women in terms of physical size and strength. You're not pro-rape, are you? You're not pro-domestic violence, are you? Then you better support these mandatory genetic modifications, otherwise you're violating equality and women's rights. All kinds of drugs and technologies can be used to fundamentally alter our psychologies, our genetics, our biology, all in the name of maximizing individual liberty and equality. And this is already happening. Just watch the news. There are no limits. This extremist liberal human rights ideology is set to destroy the human race itself. And Islam is the only religion and the only community that is pushing back and saying, no, we want to be human beings. We want to preserve our marriages, our families, our community, our humanity. We don't want this never-ending nightmare of human rights. No, thank you. We need to be clear here. This is not a debate about Sharia rejects freedom and equality versus human rights accepts them. This is really a debate about should we have restrictions on freedom and equality in order to preserve other important values versus no limits, freedom and equality extremism of Harris. That is what this debate is really about. Harris is selling you this extremism, and it's exactly like the child that only eats candy. That child is eventually going to die, just like these liberal societies are dying terrible deaths. But Sharia is the balanced meal, and that's why we need Sharia.
All right,
yeah, so do you want to respond to any of my points? Do you want to respond to the Botswana question? Explain, what does human rights really offer, Harris?
What human rights offer, maximizing pleasure, reducing suffering, and well-being of humanity.
No, you said maximizing pleasure, but that conflicts with the well-being of humanity.
No,
that's why I just okay, do you value marriage? Do you value family?
I value family, yes.
Okay, then how are you not seeing the death of family in the world all over? I read all those stats, so tell me.
Yeah, because well, some of your stats, I don't know, I haven't been able to verify that. I don't take your word for it. But what you're saying about family, which family are you talking about? One man having 4 families. The whatever family challenges that we could have in the Western world as a result of falling fertility rate. I also quoted Pew result, which said that
which you said was a good thing.
As women, listen to that, as well, for different reasons though, but as Muslims get more and more advanced, more education, their level of income goes up, their fertility is also falling down. And also, as
it's a bad thing.
One sec, just to let Harris finish.
Sir.
It has to be, there has to be a balance. Well, 2.2 would be a good balance. Every forecaster of the world's population says that we can't even keep growing indefinitely, and 10 billion might be the absolute critical, and we will start falling down after that. So these challenges will come. There's nothing absolute. That is our argument. There's nothing absolute. What you advocate for, Daniel, you say that this is absolute. This is how it is. This is how it's supposed to be. You made a point about slavery. You like the other one that you said, well, it's not obligatory to go jihad. So, okay, this is comfortable for you. And owning slave is not obligatory either. But it wasn't abolished. It wasn't abolished by that. No person can defend, to the best of my ability, and please, I would like to hear your response on that too. You actually were pro-slavery. You were saying that you could even bring back slavery. So why would you? How could anyone defend having slavery and owning other people? What about the families of those people? I mean, they're always going to live beneath the master's heel. So so whatever challenges that you have.
So you have all this concern about families, how they're treated with Islam through warfare, with slavery and so forth. What about all of the destruction to families by colonialism, by modern neocon warfare, by the invasions and occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and Vietnam, the Vietnam War, all of these things you just want to sweep under the carpet? How about we talk about the millions of people that were killed because of forced famines, because of British colonialism, the same British colonialism that was trying to spread human rights and civilization and enlightenment to the subcontinent. Your ancestors faced that kind of genocide and that kind of forced famine. And here, you don't want to stand by that? Tell us where you stand on colonialism, because you've avoided that question. You just want to talk about, oh, Muslims are barbaric because we practiced slavery. I gave you the argument for why that was not only morally justified, it was morally necessary, and all of these other cultures practiced it. All of these other religions condoned it. I cited you Lawrence Keeley, an academic who explains exactly why you have to have it to survive. Otherwise, you're going to be wiped off the face of the earth. You haven't addressed any of these things. And I just want to ask you, when you say that, okay, fine, our fertility rates
I'm going to forget all your points. I mean, if you're asking me these questions, I can respond very quickly. We can go back and forth very quickly. It's up to you. More you talk, better it is for me.
Okay, then I'll keep talking. The fertility rate issue.
One more point to add on, because it's also a challenge for the audience to follow all the points. So we'll give you one more, sure, Daniel, and then we'll kick it over to Harris right after.
Okay, sure. I don't want to monopolize. Sorry about that. But just to say about the fertility issue, you're saying that, okay, look, this is happening. It's below replacement levels in most of these Western developed countries. That means the population is going to go extinct. Like, this is literally an existential threat. So you say, okay, we need to get up to 2.2. What are you going to suggest to do that? What kind of policies? Because you have to have a policy that's not voluntary, because people are not voluntarily choosing to get married now. They're not voluntarily choosing to have families now. So what policy are you going to introduce? And that's going to limit people's individual freedom and individual choice, right? So give a suggestion. The main problem is that you can't spread these values without total war. That's the whole point. So you have to say that that's necessary, and that's justified. How are you going to get the people in Afghanistan to follow human rights? You're complaining constantly about Afghanistan. So how are those people going to accept human rights and democracy as you propose? I mean, the answer from the U.S. state is clear. They invaded and occupied for 20 years, brutal occupation. And now, even after they're gone, you have Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, saying we're going to agitate and we're going to pressure Afghanistan to start accepting LGBT rights and women's rights. And if they don't comply, we're going to, put the pressure on them. So this is all force, and it leads to suffering. You stand by all that or no? Answer.
I'll answer that to you, but
yes or no? You stand by it or no? Yes or no?
If you answer me, no, it's more complicated than that. But if you answer that, do you support Taliban or not? You said brutal occupation. You could argue about the way the war on terror was started, but after that, America was not there. There was no Governor General of America there.
There was no America in Afghanistan?
There was no government that was directly American. The government itself was Afghan. The government was Afghan. Yes, you could laugh at democracy.
They're Afghan. They weren't agents of. Look at all of the leaks that were posted by the Washington Post. They were agents. Afghan government was an agent of the U.S. government. How can you deny that historical fact?
You say it was brutal, and put a hand on your heart and say it was more brutal than the 90s Afghanistan, or even now what Afghanistan is going to be.
Yes, I did a whole video.
It was more brutal than that.
I did a 45-minute video on all the rape, all the all of the rape and torture and murder. You had Australia. You're an Australian, right? So you had Australian special forces who were hunting farmers,
Isolated
Afghan
incidents.
horses, and cutting off
Isolated
their
incidents.
fingers. No, this is a pattern of abuse. They
Isolate.
stopped
They were
counting.
punished.
They stopped.
They were punished.
Why were they even there?
punished.
You
They
just
were-
said that there
no,
was no
but
presence.
they
Now
were
you're
in-
saying they were
no,
punished
but
or isolated. So there were soldiers
they
there,
were,
right? So why are you
because
changing your story?
Because no, I'm not changing my story.
You
What
said
I'm
that
saying
there weren't
we're-
anyone.
I'm
There
preparing-
was no forces
I'm
in
preparing-
Afghanistan, right?
I'm saying
Were
no.
they
I didn't
in
say
there or not?
that. I said the
Let's- all
government.
right,
I
well,
said
hold
the
on one second.
government.
Just
I said the
so there's
government
not
was
too much
Afghanistan.
overlap.
I said the government was Afghanistan. The government was given back to Afghan people, and
Just
it was
with
a,
all
it was
these
an attempt to
occupying
democracy.
soldiers.
Unfortunately, Islam got in the way, and it said, "No, sorry, we want to live in the 7th century, and we want to be ruled by warlords, terror, intimidation, and fear, and executions, and barbarity. And democracy has no place in Afghanistan. You should be." Everyone else, every sane person, not you, that would be unexpected expectation from you. Not everyone would be happy in Afghanistan. We've seen the footages of people trying to escape Afghanistan. Why? Burqa sales have gone through the roof in Afghanistan. People are scared. Women came out and women were beaten up. Just yesterday, there was a news story.
People are trying to
woman was
escape
hunted
El
down.
Salvador and Mexico. People are trying to
But for other
escape
reasons.
all of these countries.
Let's let
Increase the fertility rate, and you offered a solution that you can only impose these policies by war. Like, I mean, you literally want to beat people up and invade a country and tell them to have sex and make more babies?
No, that's not what I said.
So what did you say? So I want to understand. I want to straw man. When you say that you have to implement,
Islam has these policies, right? In the Sharia, you can't have premarital sex. You can't have extramarital sex. You have modesty. You have gender separation. You encourage Muslims to marry young and have children and be fertile. Those are all policies within the Sharia that when people abide by them, there is higher fertility. You have stronger families. You have healthier societies because of that. That was the argument. It's not going to war.
No, but you implied that. How you asked me a question? How am I going to apply that in the Western world where fertility rates are falling? So you didn't say that.
What policy are you going to institute that will increase fertility rate?
Well, first of all, immigration is the one good policy, and we can always
bringing in Muslims from other countries.
Well, there are a lot of Indian and Chinese too, so I would prefer them first. But no, Muslims.
So that means that the
Muslims
people here are going to go extinct.
Muslims are good people. No, that's not even the case. I mean, for example, Australia pumped up the fertility rate back in the early 2010s by giving out baby bonuses. So you'll get $10,000 check if you make more babies.
So your policy of immigration relies on Islam, right? You haven't given a policy.
Not necessarily,
because it's Islam's higher fertility, or Chinese, or any of these traditional societies.
Or Indian Muslims.
Yeah, you're relying on Islam. So you've just deferred the argument. You haven't introduced a policy that will increase the population,
baby bonus,
the fertility,
$10,000
indigenous population. So you haven't really introduced the problem that you're having is you can't introduce any policy because it will restrict individual freedom. That's why you're stuck.
Okay, so again, let me tell you. Let me go back to Pew again. Because as I said, it's got nothing to do with actual not wanting to make families or whatever. It might have some part to do with it, but it's got more to do with the improving economic standards. And this is why I said that Muslim birth rates are also going down. Muslims' birth rates are also going down.
I can see that. It's a bad thing. It's a bad thing. It shows exactly why development and modernization and human rights is a bad thing. That's my entire point.
So let's stop going to work. Let's stop making money. That's your solution. So we can just stay home and make more babies.
No, that's not.
It is just one of the side effects of that, and humanity will come up with a better solution. Who knows what humanity 2.0 might be like? Who knows? We might be actually making babies in labs, or maybe we might not even need to keep increasing our humanity because we would be living 1,000 years longer. So we don't know that. These are the problems that will come even later, and we'll come up with newer solutions, and we would have more solutions.
If we survive.
You can't understand that because we will survive. Of course, we're not going anywhere. The birth rate is still going up everywhere else.
No, you just said it's not going up. You said it's going down everywhere.
No, the global birth rate is still going up.
You just said it's going down.
2060. I said 2060 in my opening statement. I said by 2060 it would start falling down even for Muslims as well, and by the end of the century it would hit a critical mass of 10 billion, and then it will start going down. Your
stats are all wrong. The birth rates are going down. Right. They're going down consistently, even in the Muslim world. The Muslim world, the fertility is going down. It's a bad thing, right? Yeah. And by 2060, what you actually cited was that Muslims, I didn't even remember what you cited, but all of the fertility rates are going down consistently across the world, and it's because of human rights modernization. Islam is saying that family is important. That's why you have to restrict individual autonomy with these kinds of rules I mentioned in the Sharia. And that's for the benefit of humanity, because you're not going to go extinct. You're not going to have
so what should we have?
replacement levels fertility, and you can't give
So
me
Daniel, what should we have?
You can't show me
What
how
should we
human
have,
rights. Sharia, that's what you should have.
No,
That's
but what's the ideal number for the planet we should have? Like 10 billion, 9 billion, 8 billion, maybe 4 billion, reducing the sizes of economy and our footprint. What would be the better one?
We should have strong, stable families that where a child can be in a family surrounded by loving family members, his father, his wife, maybe a co-wife, cousins, aunts, uncles. All that's a beautiful, stable family, very high fertility. This is the beautiful example of family life that Islam promotes. What does human rights promote? Human rights promotes a child with his single mother just going to school and falling into drugs and mental health problems. That's what human rights offers the world. And we see that with the numbers, we see that with all the stats that I gave you, and you have no response to that.
I've given you a response. Well, I've given you more nuanced response, and you're not understanding that, because these are the 21st century. That would be the latter part of the 21st century problem, and we'll come up with a solution. What you're saying, you can't give me a reason. What you're saying, you're basing that.
One sec, just to hear from Harris.
You're basing that family life is important because it gives a higher fertility rate. Higher fertility rate means increasing population. When I ask you what is the ideal population for the planet, you don't know that. You say, well, then you backtrack, and then you say, no.
How could you know that? How can anyone know the ideal population for the planet? How can anyone know that?
No. Human forecasters have actually said that over 10 billion people, the planet would not be able to handle it.
10 billion people. So what?
So 10 billion. So what happens then after 10 billion? You guys would start. If we let you have your way, you'd be like, no. We want to have the same family system, and we want to make 20 babies still. So then we'll go from 10 billion to 15 billion. So
Islam is not like that. If there is a situation that requires overall maslaha, are you aware of this, Harris? Do you have any knowledge of Islam? There's something called community decision making. If there are pressing global challenges or there are pressing problems, the imams and the Sharia can accommodate that. It's called maslaha. It's called maqasid al-Sharia. These are things that are found in Islam. It's a very nuanced system that you have no appreciation of. That's why you're constantly straw-manning. Look, your future is a future
for very good reason.
People watching Netflix at home alone, masturbating and ordering Uber Eats. That's your vision of the future, Harris. And you haven't proposed a single thing consistent with human rights that actually counters that.
People are extremists. Yes, right. I mean, obviously, maybe we have different meanings of extremism.
You're talking about these international organizations, right, and their planning. Yeah, let's talk about the plans of the World Economic Forum, where they released this position paper that they say by 2030 you will have no privacy, you will own nothing, and you will be happy. Like, this is their vision of 2030. Every individual living in a pod and eating some kind of bug-based meats because actual beef is bad for the environment and climate, supposedly. So let's have that vision of the future. That vision of the future that the World Economic Forum and the UN and all these experts, that's the vision that you're promoting, Harris. That's what you want for the future of humanity, this dystopia. And Muslims are just saying, I'm just saying, no, we don't want that future. We don't want a future where all cultures are destroyed, all religions are destroyed. You're just living in a pod by yourself and you have no family, you have no connections. You're just sitting in front of Netflix and masturbating and eating bug-based meats. Muslims are just saying, we don't want that future for humanity, and you're not proposing anything that contradicts that.
Instead, and if my child turns out to be homosexual, he needs to be thrown off the rooftop, and that is what you're proposing, which is obviously
I made it very clear. There are rules that restrict individual liberty and full equality, because those are not the only values, and you can't propose anything. This was the balance question, and you haven't proposed anything.
All right, we'll go back to Harris for a couple of minutes.
They're not the acceptable positions by your standards. I may as well go and live in China then, because if I have to take totalitarian views for collective good, then I can take some of their totalitarian views as well. talked about, you made fun of like, okay, we're going to be eating bugs or something, which kind of reminded me of are snails. I mean, let's just go back to Sharia for a little bit, right? So do you actually think Sharia is sacred? Do you think it's clear, or it's open to interpretation? What do you think about Sharia? Like, I mean, you're defending Sharia, so let's just talk about Sharia. Is it clear, or it's open to interpretation?
There are certain parts of it that are unequivocal. Qat'i is the actual term for that. And there are certain parts that are open to ijtihad, where scholars, ulama, can differ, and they can use their reasoning based on Quran and Hadith and qiyas, as well as ijma', to come to their conclusions.
You talked about eating bugs. So I mean, so that just kind of triggered in my mind. Like, do you think snails, are they halal or not? Because Sharia is a lot more complicated than that. Because dietary requirements is considered either it's halal or it's haram, and Sharia means Sharia is directly linked to your morality. So if you follow Sharia, you're moral. If you don't, you're immoral. Eating pig would be immoral because it's written in the Quran not to do it. But what about other things like, let's say, snail or a kangaroo? Do you think snail is halal?
So it will depend on which school of thought that you're following. Yeah, I mean,
Exactly.
this is not what is your point?
My point is that it is open to interpretation.
I said that. I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that.
Yeah. So you're trying to put on something to us. Then your system is not really
No, but the values that I mentioned.
Constantly evolving.
Why
Imams,
are you talking way more than 2 minutes, James? Like, what's the balance here? He's just going on and on rambling. And
Go ahead, Daniel. We'll give you several minutes.
So I brought family, marriage, romance, love. I didn't get to the points about community, but that's also valuable because people value their way of life, and Islam has brought together all of these different cultures under Islam, and they've preserved. Like, I'm Persian. Persia was conquered by Arabs, by Arab Muslims and non-Arabs too, because the original Muslim community was ethnically diverse, but it was conquered by Islam 1400 years ago. Yet Persia has retained its language, it's retained its culture, it's retained many aspects of its literature. That's because Islam is compatible with people preserving certain aspects, not all, because idol worship, for example, is not preserved, that's not allowed, but preserving certain aspects of culture over hundreds of years, and I'm living proof of that. You have Muslims who are Nigerian, who are Malaysian, who are Uyghur, who are Turkish, Desi, Arab. All of these have maintained their ethnic and cultural traditions, but modernization leads to homogeneity, the extinction of languages, people who have completely been wiped off of the face of the earth, cultures that have been wiped off the face of the earth because of colonialism, because of this human rights regime, that even today you have languages that are going extinct because of colonialism. So Islam is something that preserves community as well. This is an objective value. Okay, you're talking about snails and kangaroos. I'm talking about things that are affecting billions of people on this earth right now objectively, and you can't address any of those points. How are you going to preserve community? Okay, Islam has certain kinds of rules and regulations that preserve community. It's part of the Sharia. But what do you have to offer? What does human rights offer? You haven't addressed that. And you haven't also addressed the fact that you're blaming, you saying that people in Afghanistan are running to the airport, and you're blaming the Taliban, you're blaming Sharia because of that. But when you have people in El Salvador and Latin America who are literally risking their lives, the lives of their children, to migrate to the United States from these human rights hellholes, you don't blame that on human rights. You don't blame that on LGBT rights and women's rights that are respected and practiced throughout Latin America. Why, Haris, are they risking their lives to migrate to the U.S.? That's another question, the Botswana question that you haven't really addressed.
Well, I answered that before as well, that this is probably because one is because of the economic reasons, and the other one is for human rights violation reasons.
Why?
Yes,
How
of
do you
course.
know?
No shit.
Go ahead, Harris.
Because
I want to give Harris a couple minutes too.
Sure.
Weren't you the one who was quoting the GDPs of El Salvador and Botswana and United States? So of course it's because of why everything has to be so binary with
So
you
no
guys?
one in
Maybe you
Afghanistan
can't
cares
you
about
can't-
economics.
Want to
You
give you a
can't-
couple
you
minutes to
can't-
Harris as well.
Yes, let's just go with that, Haqiqatjou. You made multiple points, and then you let me finish because there was another point as well before that. So this is very simple. Economic reasons, people. This actually shows us our longing for better lifestyle, and we would want to go to America. We would want to go to Europe. We would want to go to Australia, better countries, so we can improve our lives. We can buy bigger houses. We can have less children. Not 4 times 2, meaning 8, not that many. We can give them good quality education, good food, good clothes, everything. This is human nature. We long for it, and that's the reason why we have. Yes, there might be consequence of falling birth rate. The same generation, same people from same community, when they go to Western countries, even they start having less kids as well. So that is a side effect of it, but that's just the way it is. But you think that when you replace it with either take it all or you don't, then sorry, we can't take that, because Sharia doesn't just come with that. It does come. You laugh at kangaroos and snails, but there are so many other baggages that come with that too, such as homosexuals, the honor culture, wife beating, multiple wives, and not to mention really bad sense of fashion. Everything comes with it. So those are the things. What did you ask earlier about? You said something else earlier about before this Botswana problem.
About community?
You were asking me another question.
Yeah, how does this human rights regime preserve community, preserve family, preserve marriage, these objective values? Are these objectives? Do you think marriage is valuable?
Well, as I said, the only reason is that we look at for the next generation.
Yes or no? Is it valuable or not?
We look at, no, it's more complicated than that, because we look at
marriage
how
is
the
not
next
valuable.
generation.
Marriage and romance and love?
No, romance and love might be, but not marriage, because marriage doesn't mean much. I mean, you can be a partner, you can be in a civil agreement with someone, and
but
you can
even
live
those are
without
declining.
marriage for 10 years.
Those are declining.
No, they're not. Well,
they are.
No,
I
not
cited
really.
all of the stats.
I don't trust your stats. Sorry, we'll have to.
You're
we'll
having
have to
people
look into
who
it.
are having permanently celibate, not having sex.
No, you're
1
talking
out
about
of 4 people, according to Pew, according to the stats I mentioned.
Okay.
Is sex valuable?
We'll have a.
Is sex valuable? Yes or no? Or is it complicated? Everything is complicated, right, Horace?
No. Well, yeah, because not everything is binary, though. Not everything is binary. Yes, sex is very valuable, and
okay, then it's declining.
It's
declining under human rights. Human rights. All these nations people are becoming celibate permanently against their will.
Not because of human rights.
Yes.
Not because of human rights, but
it?
because
What
economic standards. I mean, we are becoming consumerism. You could talk about capitalism again. This is why I said it's complicated, because there's so many things. It's not binary. You say that, okay, if we just bring Sharia and Islamic values, all of a sudden people will be locked up inside houses and they'll be making babies and everything will be hunky dory. No, that is not
Muslims actually like sex.
Solution.
Muslims like sex. We like to reproduce. Alhamdulillah. We're men, right? We're actual men. We're not these kinds of soy boys. Soy boy liberal human rights advocates. We're men.
Right. Okay.
We like to stay at our houses and have sex, actually, in marriages.
Well done. And I see I see how you say that. What kind of men you are? You actually say that. Oh, don't you want a woman who is obedient? That is your definition of manhood.
Because we like stable marriages, like 99% of other human cultures. Like 99% of other human cultures that you want to wipe out. That you want to wipe out. Yeah, wipe out the primitive people. Bomb them.
No, I'm not saying
genocide them.
Not people.
Those primitive people.
No, I said
dehumanize them.
Cultures.
Genocide those primitive people. Good job, Harris.
Cultures.
You're an amazing human rights advocate.
It's not going to work.
Primitive people.
It's not going to work. I'm talking about the cultures being primitive, and when those people come out, when they step into the top. Yes, so that's fine. Cultures, I don't care about that. But when they come out in the 21st century, they adopt modernism. When they come to the modern world, then that's good. Then everyone, whether they're from Botswana or they're from El Salvador or from India or China or Pakistan, wherever they go, Afghanistan, they go to America, or their own local countries become modern. That's fine, because then we're not going to expect 50% of our population to be obedient to us. Now, that's your definition of manhood. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you want everyone to be obedient
and my
to the
manhood
totalitarian
is still intact.
state. You want everyone to be obedient to the totalitarian technocratic state. You want all power monopolized by the central authority who can shove you in your pod and issue you social credits with constant surveillance. The system that we see in China and that's being rolled out in the EU in Europe and now being considered in Canada and North America. This totalitarian system, that's what you want. That's consistent with human rights. That's what human rights ultimately leads to, right? So those primitive cultures, primitive Muslims, primitive Aboriginals, Native Americans, we need to wipe out their cultures, and they need to adopt this universal, homogeneic, get in your pod, eat the bug meat, eat your soy, forget about sex because it's not valuable, or family is not valuable. Yeah, that's the future that you're envisioning, Haris. It's not attractive to me. It's not attractive to me.
Didn't you guys?
I don't know about
your
Hindu or Christian followers, but I think they're starting to realize that what you're offering is this con, this hoax, and it's really,
I can see.
really scary, actually. This is the terror of the modern liberal state. It's devolving. It's destroying the human race.
Okay, I can see how my Hindus and Christian followers are like turning. They're saying the Shahada and they're converting to Islam very quickly. So you need to look up the meaning of. That dream will never come true, Daniel, because people are leaving Islam, not joining Islam. The only way you can keep Islam going is, as you said, be a man, keep making babies. But you need to look up. No, you're not. No, you're not. You need to look up. You need to look up the meaning of totalitarian. I mean, you have totally.
What's the meaning?
What's the
definition?
I'm actually surprised.
Educate me,
no, hang on a sec. I'm actually surprised. I'm actually surprised that you actually didn't use, in defense of slavery, you didn't use the example of, well, modern day 9-to-5 job is slavery as well. You didn't use that because that's how you come up with these.
That kind of argument is too sophisticated for you, Haris. You can't even understand the basic argument.
You know, he was so pathetic.
You couldn't even understand. I can't educate you on all these things, Haris. Respond to the argument that I gave, not another debate. Stop riding Apus's coattails. Just respond to the argument that I gave.
You knew it was so pathetic that you actually dropped that. You were so scared to actually use that.
No.
Yes, you were.
I'm so scared. I'm terrified of you, Haris. You're a towering intellect.
I can see. I can see that.
Let me have some questions now, Haris.
So I no, you haven't even let me. Okay, all right. Ask more questions because I actually forget because you go in so many different tangents that I actually forget about what you were asking me, and then you just start having a ramble.
You're an admirer of Richard Dawkins. You've called him your hero. You think he's this towering intellectual figure. He's actually praised your book. You've praised him, but he tweeted back in 2013 this tweet: all the world's Muslims have fewer Nobel Prizes than Trinity College, Cambridge. Okay, so what is this genius implying here? He's implying that Islam is so backwards and so uneducated that they have so few Nobel Prizes. So, Haris, explain to me, how many Nobel Prizes does Latin America have? How many Nobel Prizes does China and Sub-Saharan Africa have? How many Nobel Prizes does India have? And what's the discrepancy between the Nobel Prizes in the UK? Colonialism, right?
Look,
tell Dawkins.
I get it. Those countries are colonials. But the other point is that
if it's colonialism, then educate Dawkins. Educate Dawkins because he's blaming Islam. You need to tell him that no, this is because of colonialism.
Even before Nobel Prizes became a thing, even before that, when there was no colonialism, when Islamic Caliphate was in full flow, it did not match the levels of scientific revolution that West enjoyed, or even the Islamic world enjoyed in the 9th and 10th centuries. And there is a whole scholarly work behind that, different opinions on that. Some people blame Genghis Khan, some people blame Al-Ghazali, whatever the reason was. But science or discovery in the Islamic world just went down. And unfortunately, it seems like, for example, when we just simply talk about evolution, we talk about evolution, and when the Muslim scholarly work, when universities in Muslim countries, when they don't even acknowledge evolution, how are we ever going to make any progress in the fields of biology? You could argue about physics and chemistry, and we could hope that. But again, this would be linked. Let me finish my point, man. Come on. This would come to a point that as Muslim countries advance as well, they get better. We get better economy in countries like Pakistan or Turkey or Saudi Arabia is modernizing. Now the Saudi Arabia is modernizing. We're getting better university. UAE is modernizing, better universities. Then yes, UAE has put a program. I'm happy for UAE. But that has also just come from modernism, not necessarily, not by reading the Quran or bringing Sharia back. I mean, Muslim countries are throwing Sharia out as well.
But you conceded that Islam had a golden age of science, right? So it's not Islam that's the problem. It's colonialism that's the problem.
Islamic world had it. Islamic world had it, not Islam caused it. It's like West Ham and Christian world have.
So all the problems, all the problems are blamed on Islam, and all of the positive things are blamed on everything except Islam. That's the way that you're going about it, right?
Well,
where's the principle?
What directly comes from theology, it would be blamed on that. I mean,
the theology is very clear. Allah says
slavery, sex slavery, these bite beating, these kind of things come directly from Islam. Yes,
all responded to.
People.
I responded to all of those points.
You
acknowledge that Islam is not anti-science.
Want to jump in?
No one outside of that circle is buying that. This doesn't make any sense, Daniel. If you just
they are buying it because they're part of those cultures too. The Christians and the Hindus and the Jews, they can look at their own cultures, they can look at their own traditions, they can look at their ways of life, and they'll find that there are a lot of
traditions are bad.
A lot of parallels with Islam, and then they'll realize that wow, it's the modern world that's destroying our ways of life. It's modern world that's destroying our families, our marriages, and clearly this is not sustainable. That's what they're going to realize. You just saying slavery, wife beating, concubines, that's all your whole argument is just putting out those words. You haven't addressed or been conversant. You haven't been conversant with any of the arguments or the points that I made, logically explaining, citing academics, citing studies.
Riffraff.
You haven't. Yeah, it's all riffraff. Academia is riffraff. I try to be objective.
That's not objective. You didn't even answer my objective morality question,
scientific studies aren't objective.
Well, I'm not going to take any scientific study from you. I'm not gonna take any
It's not from me. It's published in Science. It's published in Nature. Pew is Pew. You have a problem with Pew? And find this throughout all of these 99% of other societies and cultures. Read Lawrence Keeley, his book on pre-modern warfare. Read all of that and see.
They're all ancient. I know that. They're all ancient. I know that. I don't.
Yeah. So shouldn't morality be based on contextual factors?
Morality should be based on reason. In light of constantly evolving situations around us.
Yeah, exactly. There were the different situation and circumstance in the past than today. Look,
no, but that's not your claim. That's not your claim, though. This morality is for all time. You change your position. You were supposed to be literalist and honest.
Didn't I say that jihad? Didn't I say jihad? Didn't I say slavery? I said that certain aspects of Islamic law. Certain aspects of Islamic law are context dependent. They're based on ijtihad. They're based on maslaha maqasid, and certain are not. This is something that is acknowledged throughout Islamic tradition in fiqh and Sharia jurisprudence. It's all there. I haven't sugarcoated anything or hidden anything in an open book about this.
Certain rulings have always been there. Certain rulings will always stay there, and those rulings are barbaric. Yeah, but those rulings are barbaric, no,
I mean,
because this is what Baghdadi. Baghdadi said, why should I stop taking slaves? Because UNO or America tells me, which is a very valid point. Your prophet allowed you to have sex slaves. So
I gave you the reasoning for that.
You gave the reason for other imams. I don't accept that. What if I'm a literalist? What if I follow just a hadith?
I gave you an argument. Remember, I said, let me steelman your argument, Haris. Okay, people who are watching, rewind the tape and watch that section. I steelmanned your argument for you. You didn't even make that point. I made that point. And I explained why even in that situation, the world would be a better place if instead of nukes, chemical warfare, biological warfare, constant mass surveillance from intelligence agencies, and warrantless wiretapping, all of this, on one hand, and a world that has slavery, and a world that has slavery. Which one is better? And there's a lot to say about slavery being the better world, the world that's lower tech but has slavery.
Not for the slave. No, not really. Not for the slave.
It's not great for the guy who's being nuked. It's not great for the guy that's being burned alive with chemical weapons, with biological weapons. It's not great for those victims of Agent Orange, those children born with these kinds of huge heads.
I would rather be nuked. I would rather be nuked than be a slave for someone for 20 years. I would rather be nuked than be enslaved for someone for 30 years.
Than be killed by a nuclear weapon.
I'd rather be killed than be a slave.
Mr. Monster with the first question says, truly Islam does not allow for free will. Daniel, I think that's for you.
Wait, can you repeat that? Sorry.
They said clearly Islam does not allow for free will.
No, the argument that I made is that individual liberty and the freedom to choose and equality, these are beautiful values that Islam acknowledges and respects. But Islam says that these are not the only values. There are other values that are important as well and deserve to be respected and preserved. There are other institutions that deserve to be respected and preserved. Institutions like marriage, family, community, and just human biology, humanity itself. That is something that is worth preserving. But in order to preserve those things, sometimes you have to put limits on free choice, on individual liberty. And this is why Islam is balanced. But if you have this human rights extremism where free choice and free will is everything, then that leads to really bad consequences. And the stats, the objective stats, prove how that ideology is destroying marriage, it's destroying family, it's destroying community, it's destroying all these other values. The value of truth, for example. Truth is an important value. Justice is an important value. But if happiness and free will are the only values, why not just put everyone on soma, like on these kinds of antidepressants that put people in a constant state of euphoria? Why not have that kind of future using technology? Because then you'll maximize happiness. And is that going to be the best world that we would live in, where everyone is doped up on soma, like in the novel Brave New World? Is that the future that we want? No, because happiness is not the only value.
Haqiqatjou says, under Sharia, Muhammad was allowed to marry Aisha when she was 6. Would this be allowed under your system, Daniel?
I mean, this is something that many cultures practice to this day. And it's based on this biological reality. And you find many cultures where they're trying to maximize the fertility window of women because they want to have more children. And this is basically the way that evolutionary psychologists explain it. And I'm not promoting evolution, but these are people that you would respect, Harris, or other atheists. They say that it's actually to an evolutionary advantage to maximize the fertility window so you have as many children as possible, because women only have about 25 to 30 years of fertility. If they wait until they're 25 or 30 or 35 to get married and have kids or have sex, then that means they'll only have maybe 1, maximum 2 children. But this will allow extinction of the population and for the people to be wiped out. So this goes back to what Lawrence Keeley says, and this is why you find it in so many societies in the pre-modern period and even today, because it's biologically hardwired. And you have a discussion actually about whether marrying children who are pubescent, okay, so around 10 years old, 9 years old, this is something that there's a dispute and a debate within psychology whether this is a psychological disorder. And your secular atheist psychologists say that no, it can't be considered a dysfunction because it is practiced in these societies. It's evolutionarily adaptive, so it's not actually causing any harm. And when we look at the girls and the women in these societies, there's nothing that is dysfunctional about them and problematic. What's interesting is that is not considered marriage to 9-year-olds is not considered pedophilia. What is pedophilia are the practices of modern pedophiles who go into the closet and diddle little kids. That's abhorrent. That is an abomination. Islam does not promote that. Islam promotes marriage. It promotes family. It promotes these wholesome values, and other societies have practiced this as well. I mean, Richard Dawkins actually is on record speaking in multiple interviews where he actually defends mild pedophilia.
Let's move on. For Destroyer says, what book on Islamic? You've talked for 2 hours. We must go to the next one. What book on Islamic jurisprudence has Harris read? It seems he got his education of Islamic law from watching Fox News.
No, I've read all the Sahih Sitta books. I've read the Quran. I've read. Yeah, I know. I'm coming to that. I haven't read the actual books of fiqh. But I've read some pamphlets here and there. I've read some pamphlets here and there, which is that's fine. I'm only turned off I'm only turned off when I read the Quran, when I look at amputations as a solution for to save the world from theft, or to keep the society going and to keep the war economy going. We need to own slaves. I'm sorry, I've got better things to do. I'd read a book on evolution, or how the universe came about. I'd rather study that. But yeah, I've read some objections. I've looked into it, but I'm sorry, it's not very impressive.
This one coming in from, do appreciate your question. Apostate Prophet says, should Islam be enforced upon the disbelievers?
Yeah, Islam. Wait, you said Apostate Prophet? Apos?
It's Apostate Prophet.
Okay,
I don't know
Apos,
what the other word means, but
Apos, we discussed this in our debate. Go and rewatch the tape. We talked about universalism. Liberalism is a universalist ideology. It believes in imposing human rights and this kind of LGBT rights extremism on the entire planet, and it does through colonialism, through occupation, through sanctions, forced famine. That is the universalism of liberalism and human rights being imposed on the entire globe. Islam is also universalist. It also believes that Islam should spread. And I've talked about this in our debate. People can go back and watch that, which you acknowledge you lost that. So, yeah, Islam is universalist. So what? All of these other belief systems, including human rights liberalism, are universalist as well, and they employ coercion in the same way that Islam has coercion, but Islam is the truth.
Lindsay Marie says, Daniel, you really believe all Muslims don't have sex before marriage and don't sleep around on the partners?
Yeah, the stats show that. Muslims, read Stephen Fish, Are Muslims Unique? Read his book. Read the articles that I'll cite for you that show that Muslims have lower levels of premarital sex, lower levels of extramarital sex. This is something that is a sociological fact that non-Muslim academics have written about. You can look at also the World Values Survey from Engelhardt, and he also establishes the lower rate of premarital sex and support for premarital sex amongst Muslims. Now, a minority of Muslims are obviously having premarital and extramarital sex. The point is that it's at a much lower overall level than these other religions and these other modernized people.
This one coming in from, you guessed it, Apostate Prophet says, Daniel, do you prefer Islamic law or secularism? If you had the power, would you want to return the U.S. into an Islamic country? What would happen to the resistant, disbelieving men and women in this Islamic America?
So there's a lot of ways to spread Islam, right? And I invite non-Muslims in America and throughout the world to look into Islam, investigate Islam, look at these arguments that I'm making, and have an open mind. Like, you see this kind of con game and hoax that people like Harris and Apus are doing, where they're trying to repeat the same talking points, but it's all based on lies. And when you actually understand how Islam and Sharia law, orthodox, strict Sharia law, is promoting family and marriage and community and results in flourishing of human life, all people, and how this has been the case for 1400 years, then people will be open and will want to accept Islam. This is my message to non-Muslims watching, and I do it with a very sincere and open heart.
This one coming in from Dathip says, Daniel, colonialism is soaked by non-Europeans as well, mostly by Asians, Chinese and Japanese, etc., and even sub-Saharan Africa, like Ida Amin.
Idi Amin.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Like that's proving my point. You have people conquering and being conquered throughout human history. This is why war and slavery and sex slavery are so ubiquitous throughout human history across all these cultures. But there is no colonialism like modern European colonialism, because modern European colonialism has technology, and that enables more genocide. Now, of course, there were genocides in the past, ethnic genocides that happened, but Islamic conquest is not genocidal, and it's not ethnic based, because people can convert into Islam. conquered people, like the Persians, like my ancestors, they converted into Islam and they achieved equal status with the conquering Muslim community. So this is very unique in Islam. This is why Islam has been so ethnically and culturally rich and diverse, but you don't find this with European colonialism because it wipes people out. We have so many people, Native Americans, Aboriginals, Asians, that have gone completely extinct because of European human rights colonialism.
So basically, your ancestors
this one coming in,
gave
I hate
up.
to do this.
They
I hate to do this, but just because we have so many. Cold Loyalty says, Daniel, are you not aware that Islamic groups pushing Sharia law are currently committing vicious murders of families and children and posting them on the internet? What about those destroyed families?
No, I don't condone any kind of barbarism. There are many terrorist groups. Many of these terrorist groups are actually agents of different intelligence agencies, and they deliberately commit atrocities and post it online to make Islam look bad, to make Sharia look bad. These are just, counterintelligence operations, the same kind of operations that have been used for many groups by modern intelligence agencies from the West and from Israel. So I condemn these kinds of terroristic actions, and I don't endorse them at all. I've never endorsed them.
The Prophet says the Quran describes disbelievers, including Jews and Christians, as quote-unquote worst of creatures and quote-unquote less than cattle. Does Daniel agree this fits with the Sharia law?
Well, Islam is universalist, as I mentioned, and it says that belief in God and accepting of God's messengers is an important part of being a good and moral person. And rejecting God and rejecting his signs, rejecting his message to humanity, the Creator's message to humanity, this is a very immoral thing to do. In fact, it's one of the most immoral things to do. Associating partners with God, creating idols to worship in place of God. These are some of the worst things, the most immoral things to be done. And so this is the moral vision that Islam offers, and there's a lot to say about that. There's actually a video that I'm going to publish in about a week called The Genius of Islam, episode 3, that's going to talk about the evil of idol worship and associating partners with God. And so I invite everyone to watch that for a more detailed elaboration of this.
This one coming in from Azri. Schizophrenia says, Daniel, do you think it is just and righteous to prevent people from speaking against Islam, to conceal testimony, what other people have? Is that what Allah stands for?
Yeah, so Islam restricts freedom of speech, and this is something that all cultures and societies restrict, freedom of speech. And you can read the book by Stanley Fish. He's a philosopher that says there's no such thing as free speech, and it's a good thing too. And the idea is that to maintain social cohesion and social order, you have to have certain speech norms, and you have to limit speech in order to maintain those kinds of bonds and social cohesion. Otherwise, you're going to have chaos and destruction. And so all societies prohibit speech, and liberal societies and modern liberal human rights governments in the West are the most restrictive when it comes to speech, because they literally assassinate and have a history of assassinating people throughout the world that have spoken out against liberalism, against democracy. Look at the assassination of civil rights leaders in American history who were arguing for racial acceptance, such as Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. They were assassinated by the deep state because of their opposition to the secular world order and the racist neo-colonial world order. So this is something that all
Daniel, you're a
about
conspiracy
liberal.
theorist.
Wait, let me answer the question. You're not getting any questions. You don't get to interrogate me along with APUS and all of these atheists.
Conspiracy theorists.
So let me just talk
Deep
about
state.
deep state.
Let's give him a chance to respond.
Historical facts about the assassination of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. And look at the colonial period, where you have Britain, you have France, you have the Netherlands, who are controlling colonies, and they are stamping out with brutal authority any opposition to colonial rule. They have to do this. Okay, they have to do this. Otherwise, liberalism won't be accepted by. So this is the free speech of liberalism and human rights.
This next one, Leptoceratops says, Daniel, if a husband forces sex upon his wife against her will, is that wrong under Sharia?
So Islam comes with certain marital rights. Husbands have certain rights and duties. For example, the husband has to provide shelter, he has to provide clothing, he has to provide food. It doesn't matter if the husband doesn't want to provide those things, he has to. And the state, the qadi, basically the Islamic State, can force the husband against his will to provide nafaqah for his wife and for his children and his family. This is something that's good. This is an important policy that reduces the man's individual liberty. And similarly, the woman's individual liberty is also restricted, that if the husband has a reasonable request for sexual relations, reasonable, then she is obligated to comply with that. If she decides not to, he can't start beating her and he can't start abusing her in a violent way. But the qadi can say that, look, you're not meeting your spousal duties, and therefore you will forfeit your mahr, for example, the bride dowry. You'll forfeit your other privileges as a wife. So there's give and take in marriage. That's why Islam is beautiful, because it creates this dependency between husband and wife. It's not like modern sexless marriages in the West where women say, oh, I can leave my husband to have no sex for months because I don't feel like it. I'm a strong, independent woman. And meanwhile, the husband is working his tail off trying to provide for his family, but there's no obligation on his wife to reciprocate in any kind, because she's a strong, independent feminist and she has to have maximum choice and opportunity. But the poor devil, he has to work and provide for all of that with no compensation or anything.
Said Daniel, if your own child openly engaged in sexual interactions with the same sex, would you want your child to be executed in your ideal Islamic system?
If my own child, do I want my own children and family to be subject to the Sharia? Yes.
Gotcha. This one from Apostate Prophet says, for Daniel, if he wants to force Islam, execute apostates and enslave disbelievers, would it be okay to do the same to Muslims and Muslim converts? If not, why not? Please answer the question.
Would it be? No. Why would I want people to be, the people who stand for truth and justice and righteousness, to be enslaved? Why? Like, just because you accept that warfare is necessary and slavery is necessary doesn't mean that you yourself are fine with being defeated in war. Again, I can ask anyone that question. Like, do you think war is necessary? And then you say, yes, war is necessary. Okay, so you're fine with being defeated in war. You're fine with being blown up. You're fine with being droned. What's the logic of that? It doesn't make sense. Yes, sometimes war is necessary. I explained how sometimes slavery is necessary, sex slavery is necessary. Do I want that to happen to me? No, I don't want to die in a war. I don't want to be enslaved, obviously. But that's not some kind of hypocrisy. Like Apus, here, I'll talk about Apus. Like, he is just a con man. He has to lie, like just me. Like Harris, to his Hindutva audience, his Christian loser audience, who they are not able to actually think for themselves. They just follow this con man.
Conspiracy theories.
All of these points have been addressed. All of these points have been addressed in our debate that I had with Apus. But he's such a crybaby loser that he has to hijack this debate.
All right,
and Harris is such a cuck that he allows Apus to hijack his stage and his spotlight. Doesn't that make you feel like a loser, Harris? Doesn't that make you feel like
you're driving the
that your big daddy Apus,
your rhetorical skills are good.
I gotta respond.
Your big daddy Apus is taking your spotlight. Are you second fiddle to Apus, Harris?
Daniel,
answer that question. Because you're not getting any questions from the audience. No one cares about any of
your...
All right,
exactly.
All right, we must go.
Because my position is so sensible, people are like, whatever he says.
Okay, well, if you ask Harris a good question, we gotta give him a chance to respond.
Are you Daniel. Schoolboy cuck, Harris?
Come on.
You're just defending what everyone already has been indoctrinated with. So I actually have the larger task of bringing arguments, bringing evidence,
like
citing
7th century old house.
Citing
1400 years old. 1400-year-old ideas are new ideas.
Go to the next one. We've got so many questions. I hate to do this. The Super Destroyer says, Apus got go respond to Fareed responds. Okay. And then Scrump Yang says, Daniel, you haven't demonstrated how your stats relate to your arguments. Just throwing stats at someone and thinking you're won isn't how you win.
No, they are relevant. The stats were relevant to how family is dying out. within the modernized human rights world. That's how it's relevant. How families are dying out, marriages are dying out, communities are dying out, and that is the human rights regime that is causing this kind of destruction. What other explanation is there when you have these highly modernized, highly secular states who are abiding by these human rights in the West, in the US, in Canada, in Europe, in Australia, and their marriages are dying out? They have no fertility because fertility rate is below replacement levels. So these are bad things. Everyone acknowledges objectively that these are very bad things. So what's causing that? What's causing that is this extremism of individual rights, individual liberty above all else. That was the argument, and all of the stats are perfectly relevant to that.
This one coming in from, thank you very much for your question. The Super Destroyer says, why is Harris Sultan running away from the debate topic?
Good question.
Well, I don't know
That's
what
very
he's
good.
About.
Statists have this.
People don't do it.
Well,
that's your kids. That belongs to your kids.
Pikachu.
Okay, you know what? So,
don't you want to call me Pikachu again?
No, I don't want.
This is Pikachu.
A lot of people have told
would
you
a
that.
sadist have Pikachu right here?
It's
Pikachu endorses me.
We
Pikachu,
must go
do
to
you
the
want
next one.
Sharia? Yes, I want Sharia.
Apostate prophet says,
you will be thrown off the rooftop.
All right, we'll talk to Pikachu
Yes,
later. They say,
is
does
Harris
Daniel,
a con man? Yes, he is.
Does Daniel
Yes.
believe that executing those who openly leave Islam will make humans happier? Does he think 21st century sociology and psychology agree?
Yeah, so every community punishes defectors. Every community punishes defectors, and this is part of preserving community. I mentioned the example of how liberals are the most brutal in terms of punishing defectors and apostates from liberalism. They have created this colonial regime where they were assassinating anyone who resisted their British or their French or their Dutch rule. So this is something where we even notice to this day of how the United States, even with this recent political election, presidential election, there are a lot of cracking down on speech, a lot of cracking down, a lot of people, dissenters in prison, and labeling them as terrorists and extremists. This is how speech is cracked down upon within even current day America. This is something very typical and very usual within all societies. Again, read Stanley Fish, there's no such thing as free speech, and Islam is no different. The thing is that the modern secular state has this massive control grid. You have literally a social credit system in Europe now, in China, that completely controls people at an individual level, and that's how social cohesion and order is brutally enforced. But in Islam, you have organic social order based on shared belief, on shared values, on family, on community, and that creates social cohesion because people naturally don't want to harm others who are in their community. But if people are apostating and leaving and blaspheming, then that threatens the social cohesion of Muslim society, and that's why there has to be penalties and punishments on defectors. But in substance, this is no different than any other community in history, and even the so-called modern civilized West. It's just that the modern civilized West has this massive control grid because they've wiped out the family relations, the organic relations with community, and all that has been wiped out in favor of this monstrous control grid, social credit system, surveillance state that we're all suffering under.
You got it, and thank you very much. Want to mention, folks, I think I already mentioned it earlier, but want to mention it again. It's been pinned in the chat for a while. We cannot take any more questions. We can't take any more, so please don't send any more questions. The Super Destroyer says, verses you'll never hear quoted in the Quran. They say Quran 90, 12 through 13. And they say, and what will make you realize what, quote, attempting, unquote, the challenging path is, it is to free a slave.
Yeah, is that, I can respond to that.
If you'd like,
yes.
Go ahead.
Freeing a slave is a highly meritorious action in Islam. It's something that is encouraged, but I'm not like other apologists. I am very honest. I say that Islam did not abolish slavery, and I gave the justification for that. If Islam abolished slavery, it would have been wiped out. Muslims would have been exterminated. basically for most of Islam's history. So yes, freeing slaves is highly meritorious, and there's a lot of details about that because it's encouraged in the Quran, it's encouraged in the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Just like giving charity is meritorious, feeding the orphan is meritorious, all of these kinds of charitable actions are very encouraged in Islam, but that doesn't mean that Islam is, abolishing private property, or Islam is abolishing having personal wealth or slaves. Yes, that is allowed as mentioned in the Quran, but it's meritorious to free the slaves.
You got it. Thank you. The apostate prophet says, does Daniel want to go back to creating an Islamic empire and spreading Islam? Does he want to bring slavery back in that case?
Yeah, so I mentioned this argument about slavery, a world with slavery that's low tech versus the horror, the terror of the modern nuclear drone trillion-dollar weapons program directed at the third world, at Vietnam, at Africa, at the Middle East. That is the kind of world that we live in that makes slavery obsolete. It's because of these weapons programs, these nukes, weapons of mass destruction, that makes slavery obsolete. But that is a worse thing. That those weapons are a bigger harm and a bigger disaster on the human race, as opposed to having a lower tech society but practices Islamic slavery. That is preferable. Since Harris just left, let me do the closing and then we can do questions. So I offered a very simple argument for the Sharia. I explained that you have these values within the Sharia that promote family, that marriage, community, and even the human race itself, and that individual liberty and equality, while they're important, beautiful values in Islam, they're not the only values. You have to have a balance with all of these values in order to promote important things like marriage, in order to promote important things like community and family. So that was the summation of the argument. I brought all of these statistics that were relevant to how human rights liberalism is destroying these important human institutions. Specifically, I posed 3 questions to Harris. Not surprisingly, he didn't have any answers. First, I asked the Botswana question, what do human rights offer? If they're supposed to offer prosperity, why do liberal secular democracies like Botswana or Haiti or El Salvador have 10 times or 50 times lower GDP per capita than the small minority countries the small minority of countries in North America and Western Europe? So Harris didn't respond to that question. The balance question, should individual liberty and equality be balanced with other values in order to preserve important human institutions like marriage, family, and so forth? If so, how? What restrictions should be in place, and on what basis to increase fertility rate, household size, lastingness of marriage? Again, Harris didn't have any proposal or answer to that question. And the colonial question, how is Harris's calling for human rights different from what colonial powers did to justify brutal occupation and genocide over the past 200 years? Assuming that many countries historically refused to accept Western human rights liberalism, does Harris think it was justified for those countries to be forced to accept them via colonialism? Does he think such force should be used today to coerce other countries to accept human rights? Harris didn't really respond to that question at all. So these questions are not specific to Harris. I encourage all of the listeners, Muslim, Christian, whoever, pose these 3 questions: Botswana question, balance question, colonial question. Pose this to con men like Harris. Pose them to people who are pushing this critique of Islam. Point out these questions and demand answers. Why can't they answer these simple questions? They can just engage in these kinds of distractions. I responded to everything that Harris brought up, okay, in terms of slavery, sex slavery, wife beating, capital punishment. I responded to everything. He didn't respond to a single one of my points. And that's fine, because I knew that he wouldn't be able to, but others should pose these questions to him and other ex-Muslims. So yeah, and overall, like I mentioned before, I invite everyone to study Islam, look further into Islam, get past these lies and propaganda from propagandists, and investigate with an open mind. And I hope that more people will see that Islam offers a very attractive, beautiful vision for human life and for humanity overall. And once you get past these points of propaganda against Islam that have been propagated by colonial powers, by neocons, once you see through their lies and distortions and half-truths, then you can see exactly what Islam has to offer all of humanity.
Coming in from Lindsay Marie says, Daniel, if you're such a proponent of Sharia, why don't you leave the US then? Why continually condemn the West, but yet you stay?
I already addressed that. I already addressed that. Where should I go where my immediate life is not in danger and the life of my family? Because you have, again, this human rights regime, the US empire, that is literally bombing and invading countries, occupying them, imposing sanctions, assassinating people, anyone who is opposing their global dominance. So this is something that we can see even in Afghanistan. There was a drone bombing as the US is leaving, like even as the US is leaving their 20-year brutal occupation, they drone strike this family, or these children actually, and an aid worker. And they admitted that it was an innocent aid worker and children. At first, the US claimed that was ISIS-K that they had droned. But then, after investigation, they found out that no, it was actually children, innocent children that the US had droned. And is there any accountability for that? No, there's no accountability. There's no punishment for this brutal kind of imposition that the world thinks that it owns the whole world and it can bomb everyone into submission. And they have stated that they want to continue to pressure Afghanistan to abide by human rights. Otherwise, we're going to pressure, agitate, we're going to impose sanctions. So that's still the plan. The US hasn't given any kind of guarantee that they'll leave the Muslim world alone, leave Afghanistan alone. If the US actually were to promise, like, look, we're not going to do anything with Afghanistan or the Muslim world, we're not going to pressure, we're not going to agitate, then yeah, I would love to move to Afghanistan or any of these Muslim countries if it means that the US and these Western powers will leave the Muslim countries alone. But they won't. They haven't given any guarantee. They have no plans to leave it alone. They just want to dominate the entire globe. And so that's the reality. And all of you liberals and human rights defenders that are asking these asinine questions, ask yourself, why are people in El Salvador and Mexico and in parts of North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa risking their lives to migrate to the Western world, like North America, like Europe? They're literally risking their lives to leave countries that abide by human rights. So isn't that an indictment of human rights and liberalism? Why can't you make that argument? Why can't you be consistent? And Harris, as I mentioned, he doesn't advocate for his followers in Pakistan, living in Muslim countries, to move to Botswana, LGBT rights Botswana.
Move on. From Luis Romero, thanks for your question, says, Daniel, about the maximizing pleasure conflicts with well-being, quote, is glorification of suffering the logical reaction to reconcile a non-ideal reality with an idealized deity who wants suffering?
I don't think that Islam wants suffering. Islam is trying to give guidance for humanity so that human beings can live their best life and flourish and enjoy and have a beautiful life. That's what Islam offers, and that's very explicit in the most hardcore orthodox understanding of Islam, and it's very clear in the Quran and the Islamic sources of revelation. We are meant to live a happy life, to live a joyous life, to enjoy our family, to enjoy our children, to enjoy our spouses. This is something that Islam wants for humanity, not suffering. Maybe that's like a Christian understanding, but Islam doesn't have that. It's just the Creator knows best what is best for us and what is going to lead to that happiness. And some of those things are beyond our understanding if we don't think about it. But when we actually look into some of these provisions within Islamic law, Some of them are going to limit individual freedom. That's true. Some of them are going to limit equality. That's true. But overall, the overall benefit is going to be for the benefit of human beings and happiness. The thing about man-made rules and regulations, such as are found in liberal human rights, is that it's coming from a finite mind. So when the liberal theorists in the 1960s, with their sexual revolution, said that people should be open to have sex with whoever they want, whenever they want, they couldn't anticipate that the harms that would come 50 years, 60 years, 100 years down the line. All of the stats showing that marriages are dissolving, people are involuntarily celibate because men and women, they can't find someone to even have sex with. They couldn't have anticipated these kinds of problems because they're human beings. They have finite intellects. This is exactly why we need divine guidance from the creator of human beings.
You got it. This one coming in from, do appreciate your question. Leptoceratops says, did I ask this? Which current countries that exist today come closest to implementing true Sharia?
I really don't know. I haven't done an analysis of all the countries and all of their policies to be able to judge that. So I can't make a definitive statement.
Gotcha. And then this one coming in from San Oberlander says this whole debate was, let's see, that's confusing. I'm not sure what that means, but
yeah, maybe one more question.
You got it. One more. And I'm going to try to find somebody who we haven't heard a question from yet, given that we're doing that. Let's see. Contrarian 420 says, Harris, how would you compare the impact of your government on reducing your human rights versus religion? Are you allowed outdoors without a fine?
Wait, that's for Harris, right?
Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I'm like still waiting.
It's been a long 3 hours.
It has, and thank you again for staying with us. That helps. It really does mean a lot that you do that. And Luis Romero says, Daniel, about the, oh God, I think we read that. Mandrew Bolson says, Daniel, why in a world on the verge of overpopulation would you want higher fertility? P.S. Studies show the nuclear family is unneeded as well.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if there's really a problem with overpopulation. To be honest, I haven't looked into exact metrics for determining what is or is not overpopulation. What I see in the world today is that the West and these high GDP countries in the West are dominating the world's resources, where they are less than 10% of the population in the United States, in Canada, and Western Europe. Less than 10% of the population, but have control over 60% of the world's wealth. So if you have a situation of massive inequality, then that will lead to a lot of resource problems, a lot of overpopulation problems. But these are artificial problems that have been created by this modern colonial nation state system that's really a disaster. It's a nightmare for humanity.
You got it.